Thus far, our discussions about patterns have largely focused on gang of four patterns described and presented in isolation. However, that's not actually how patterns work in practice. So we're going to start focusing now on groups of patterns, starting with a discussion of pattern collections. When I give you the overview of pattern collections, I think you'll recognize this very quickly. And hopefully I can also demonstrate the need for going beyond pattern collections to look at more sophisticated forms of pattern relationships. As we've seen in our discussions of the bridge pattern and the composite pattern and so on, standalone patterns provide point solutions to relatively bounded problems that arise in particular contexts. We've been focusing primarily on the context of expression tree processing apps. And of course, those patterns are interesting, but the patterns we're describing are useful for many more things than just that particular application domain. A common way to group multiple standalone patterns together is to organize them in the form of something known as a pattern collection. And a pattern collection is essentially just an intentionally organized grouping of patterns. And of course, by far the most famous pattern collection are the set of patterns described in the Gang of Four book, which I show you here. This diagram is actually from one of the covers. I think it might be the inside cover of the Gang of Four book, one of the printings. And it shows all the different patterns and then how they relate to each other from the point of view of the Gang of Four's perspective around the time they wrote the book. A pattern collection can be ad hoc, or it could address a given domain, a given problem, or a particular level of abstraction, and many other things as well. You could have pattern collections for things like operating system patterns or user interface patterns, or so on and so forth. Likewise, the organization of the patterns in the collection may be either structured or unstructured. So let's take a look at some examples of these different approaches. So the classic Gang of Four book, the Pattern-Oriented Software Architecture Volume 1 book, the various pattern languages of program design or PLoPD books are all examples of pattern collections. The pattern collections that are described in the Gang of Four and POSA 1 books are well structured. They organize them into different categories. You have things, for example, like creational patterns or structural patterns or behavioral patterns and so on. Likewise, or perhaps conversely, the pattern collections that are described in the PLoPD books are less structured. Those books were all written by different authors with different perspectives, looking at patterns in different ways. And so they really are just a collection of patterns, but they're not really structured in any coherent way. And that's not meant as a criticism. It's just because the books were done by taking papers that were submitted and reviewed in writers' workshops at the Pattern Languages of Programming Conference, the so-called PLoP conference, and then organized into volumes of books later on. In practice, however, standalone pattern islands or just individual patterns are very unusual. We almost never see patterns used in isolation. In fact, any substantial software, be it graphical user interfaces or middleware or electronic stock trading, or pick your favorite application domain like expression tree processing apps that we've been covering here, inevitably includes many patterns. So just as we've covered over a dozen Gang of Four patterns in our discussion of the expression tree processing app, any non-trivial piece of software is going to include many patterns. For example, the diagram you see here comes from work that I've done over decades in the area of object request brokers and communication middleware. And as you can see, to build this type of middleware, which involves hundreds of thousands, if not millions of lines of code, there's actually dozens and dozens of patterns that work together to help guide and document and influence the way in which the software architecture is put together. So an obvious question that arises is, how should we organize all these patterns? Do we have to memorize them one at a time? Do we put them in a big book without giving much structure? What's the best way to organize things? So we'll turn our